It was the sound that stopped me first. Not the hymn fading in the chapel, not the polite coughs of mourners finding their coats, but a raw, unshaped cry, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than lungs. I turned toward the side hallway, away from the crowd drifting toward the coffee urns. There he was, a boy maybe 14, slumped on a wooden bench under a narrow stained glass window. His face was buried in his hands, shoulders shaking. The crumpled tissue in his fist looked too small for the work it had to do. I stood still as if sudden movement might make the moment vanish. Funerals are strange that way. They hold you between wanting to run and wanting to kneel. My own hands, empty and restless, twitched with the habit of reaching for someone. But before I could move, a woman appeared at the far end of the hallway. Sharp black heels on tile, head high. She glanced toward the boy. Or maybe she didn't. If she did, the glance was the kind you give a closed door. She walked right past him, no hand on his shoulder, no pause in her steps, and disappeared into the brighter light of the foyer. I waited for him to lift his head, to follow her, to do something. He didn't. He just sat there folded in on himself, the sound in his chest breaking into smaller pieces until it was almost a whisper. I told myself, someone else will come. A father, an aunt, anyone. Someone will see him. I stayed in the doorway a moment longer, the cool stone under my feet, the scent of lilies pressing in. When nothing changed, I turned away, because the service was over and people were already calling my name. But the image stayed. It stayed as I poured coffee into a paper cup, as I nodded to a neighbour's story about the weather, as I drove home past the frozen fields. The boy, the shaking shoulders, the tissue, and that woman's unbroken stride. I didn't know their names, didn't know their story. I told myself it was none of my business. Still, when I closed my eyes that night, I saw the same hallway, the same bench, the same silence where a voice should have been. A simple human voice saying, "I see you. I'm here." I didn't know it then, but that quiet cruelty, that gap where love should have stepped forward, would come back to me. It would follow me into sleepless nights, into the glow of a phone screen, into a conversation that would begin with a stranger's pain and end with my own life changed forever. My name is Grace, and if you know anything about me, know this. I can't walk past pain, not without feeling it in my own skin. I'm 54 years old, a retired hospice nurse, a widow for nearly a decade, and the mother of one grown daughter who lives 3 states away. My life now is quiet, measured in morning walks, library books, and the small rituals that keep loneliness from settling too deep. For 30 years, I stood at the edges of other people's endings. In hospice, you learn quickly. The smallest kindness can mean more than any grand gesture. Adjusting a pillow so a neck rests easier. Warming a blanket before draping it over thin shoulders. Holding a hand, not to say anything, but to let someone feel they are still here, still held. Those moments, invisible to most, are what I came to believe in. So when I saw that boy in the hallway at the funeral, I didn't just see grief, I saw the absence of those small mercies. I've been in rooms where people were too afraid to touch the dying, too awkward to comfort the living. And every time, it left a mark on me. That hallway replayed in my mind as I filled the kettle. As I tapped the spoon against the side of my mug, I could hear the hiss of steam, smell the sharpness of Earl Grey. And still, there was the sound of his sobs trapped under the weight of being ignored. I sat by my kitchen window that evening, the mug warm in my hands, watching the winter light fade into the trees. You'd think after so many years in hospice I'd be used to grief in all its shapes. But no. The truth is, it still cuts. And this cut was different. It wasn't about loss alone. It was about how someone could walk right past a person they should love and leave them stranded in their sorrow. Maybe it matters so much to me because I've been on both sides, the one who comforts and the one who, in my younger years, didn't know how to. I've failed before. I've learned the hard way that you don't get many chances to show up for someone in those moments. And if you miss them, you don't always get them back. That's why I couldn't let it go. That boy's unattended grief. It felt like a thread I was meant to follow, even though I didn't know where it would lead. I only knew it was pulling me towards something that mattered. It was one of those nights when sleep just wouldn't come, the kind where you shift your pillow, smooth the sheets, close your eyes, and still your mind refuses to quiet down. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I reached for my phone, knowing it was the worst thing to do if I wanted to sleep, but doing it anyway. I told myself I'd just check the weather for tomorrow, maybe skim a few headlines. But you know how it goes. One tap leads to another and suddenly you're scrolling through the endless tide of strangers' lives. That's when I saw it. A post on Reddit tucked in a corner of a grief support forum I'd visited once or twice. The title read, "The shock from my mum's death was a signal I couldn't ignore." I tapped it open, expecting something general, maybe about the way loss makes you reevaluate your priorities. But instead, the words on the screen pulled me upright in bed. A man, his name wasn't given, was writing about the day they buried his mother. How, after the service, his teenage son had broken down in the hallway. How the boy's stepmother had walked right past him without stopping. And how, in that single moment, something inside him shifted. He wrote, "That was the day I knew my marriage was over, because if she could walk past my son in his worst moment, one day she'd walk past me too." I stared at the words, my heart thudding in my chest. It was as if someone had taken the memory from my own eyes and poured it into text. The hallway, the sobbing boy, the woman's unbroken stride, it was all there. My mind went back to that day, to the smell of lilies and the echo of her heels on the tile. I read his post twice, 3 times, the soft blue glow of the screen lighting my hands. There was more. About the months of coldness before, the way grief had stripped away any excuses he'd been making for her. He said he'd been sleeping in the guest room for weeks, long before the funeral, but that moment was the final piece he needed to see the truth. I didn't comment. I didn't upvote. I just sat there in the dark, the phone warm in my hand, breathing as quietly as I could, as if not to disturb the fragile connection between his words and my memory. I didn't know him, but I knew that moment, and I had a feeling this wasn't the last time it would find me. Reading that post brought something back I hadn't expected, the weight of my own first widowhood. I was 44 when my husband, Michael, died. A sudden heart attack in the middle of a Tuesday morning. One moment I was brewing coffee, the next I was following an ambulance down a rain-slick road, praying into the steering wheel. At the funeral, I remember feeling like I'd stepped out of my own body. The world moved in muffled sounds, colours dimmed at the edges. I sat in the front row, hands folded in my lap, staring at the casket as if staring hard enough might reverse time. And that's when they came. Not my closest friends or family because they were drowning too. But strangers. The kind who hover at the edges of a gathering, ready to step in. One woman I'd never seen before knelt beside me and pressed a cold bottle of water into my hands. Another, a hospice nurse from the church who barely knew my name, draped a warm blanket over my legs without a word. That blanket. I can still feel its weight. It was the first time all day I noticed I was cold. And for a moment, just a moment, I could breathe a little deeper. That's what empathy is. It's oxygen when your own breath feels locked away. It's noticing the smallest discomforts, thirst, chill, the way your hands can't quite stop trembling, and meeting them without asking. Those small mercies were my lifeline in a sea of loss. I don't remember much else from that day, but I remember their hands. So when I think of that boy in the hallway, and the man on Reddit telling his story, I keep circling back to her, the wife who walked past. I wonder if she felt anything in that moment, if she saw the curve of his back, the shaking of his shoulders, if she thought she'd deal with it later when the room was brighter, or if she'd trained herself so well to step around someone's pain that she didn't even see it anymore. And I wonder about him, the boy. What did that moment teach him about love? About who will stand beside you when your world breaks? It's strange how certain memories braid themselves together. Michael's funeral, the kindness of strangers, the hallway at another funeral years later, the words of a man I'd never met. All carrying the same quiet truth. When someone's heart is breaking, you have exactly one chance to show up. And it matters more than you think. It was a Thursday morning, the kind where the air feels like it's still waking up. I'd gone to the little cafe on the corner, the one with the chipped blue door and the smell of cinnamon that seems to settle into your coat. I stood in line, scanning the chalkboard menu I'd memorized years ago, when a voice ahead of me ordered, 2 blueberry muffins. And just a black coffee, please. Something about the way he said it tugged at me. When he turned slightly to reach for his wallet, I saw his face. And my stomach gave a small, startled twist. I knew that face. Not from my neighborhood, not from church, but from the small profile picture on a Reddit post I'd read in the dark weeks ago. It was him. The man who'd written about the hallway, the man whose words had felt like they were pulled straight from my own memory. I almost didn't say anything. You don't just walk up to someone and announce you've read their grief online. But fate didn't seem to care about etiquette that morning. The cashier set his 2 muffins on the counter, and he looked at them like he wasn't sure how they'd multiplied. He gave a small, sheepish laugh. Guess I was distracted. I meant to order one. Before I could stop myself, I said, "They freeze well. Or you could share." He turned, and his eyes landed on me with a kind of quiet focus, as if trying to place where he knew me from. But of course he didn't. I was just a stranger in line. "I suppose I could," he said softly, almost to himself. We ended up at neighbouring tables, and one muffin somehow ended up between us. We talked about nothing at first, the weather turning, the new pastry case, how the city never seems to fix the potholes on Main Street. But underneath it, there was a current neither of us named. It wasn't until his hand wrapped around the coffee mug, and I caught the faint tremor that I asked, gently, "Was it your mother's service? The one you wrote about?" He froze, eyes narrowing just enough to register surprise. And in that moment, as he nodded slowly, I knew without a shred of doubt, the boy in the hallway, the woman walking past, the story that had haunted me. They were his. They were real. And I was sitting across from the man who'd lived them. We sat there for a moment, the hum of the cafe wrapping around us before he spoke again. "My mother's name was Eleanor," he said, as if introducing someone who might still walk in the door. His voice softened when he said it. "She was warm in a way you can't fake. She remembered everyone's favourite pie, even people she only saw twice a year. She was the one who made holidays feel like holidays." He told me how she'd been sick for a while but never stopped fussing over other people. How, even in the hospital, she'd ask the nurses about their kids, how she'd save half her dessert to give to Ben, his 14-year-old son. "They were close," he said, eyes on the rim of his coffee cup. "Closer than most grandmothers and grandsons I've seen. Losing her." He trailed off, his thumb rubbing at a crumb on the table. Then he told me about the funeral, how the chapel had been full of people, the air heavy with flowers and the sound of subdued crying. How, after the service, everyone began to drift toward the reception room, that awkward in-between where grief and small talk collide. That's when he saw Ben slip away down the hallway. "I followed him," Mark said, "but only far enough to see him sit down on that bench. He just folded in on himself, shoulders shaking, head down. I was about to go to him when Lara walked in from the other end. She saw him. I know she saw him. And she just kept walking. Didn't touch him, didn't stop, didn't even slow down. Like he was invisible. His jaw tightened, and there was a small creak from his chair as he leaned back. That's when I knew, he said simply. Not just that the marriage was over, but that I couldn't trust her with the people I love. If she could walk past my son in that moment, she could walk past me too. Maybe she already had. He let out a slow breath, as if setting the memory back down on the table between us. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I knew the weight of telling something like that. How it lives in your body, not just your mind. He glanced toward the cafe door then, at the light spilling in from the street, and for a second his eyes looked far away, like he was back in that hallway, watching her heels carry her out of sight. Mark didn't speak for a while after that, just turned the coffee mug slowly in his hands, as if it might give him the next words. When he did, his voice had shifted, lower, steadier. The thing is, that hallway moment wasn't the start, he said. It was the sum. He began to tell me about the years before. How Lara had a way of keeping score in a marriage that was supposed to be about giving without counting. If he forgot to say thank you for dinner, she'd withdraw for days. If Ben didn't phrase something just right, she'd correct him sharply, as though feelings were grammar errors. It wasn't that she never showed kindness, Mark said. She did, but it was timed, measured. Like she was cashing in tokens she'd earned. A hug when it suited her schedule. Listening, but only when she felt like it was worth her while. And if you needed her in the wrong moment, well, you'd pay for that. He rubbed his temple, and I could almost see the ledger he was talking about. The invisible book where every small cruelty was tallied. That day at the funeral, he went on, when she walked past Ben, it was like she'd just written the total at the bottom of the page. All the little things, the impatience, the sighs, the corrections, the cold silences, they added up. I think I'd been pretending they didn't mean anything. But they did. They always do. I thought about my years in hospice, how it was never just the big gestures that mattered. It was the daily tone of a voice, the hand that reached or didn't. The ignored glass of water, the turned back. Mark looked at me then, as if to check whether I understood. I nodded. It's not the one moment, I said quietly. It's the pattern. But the one moment, that's when you finally see the pattern for what it is. His shoulders eased just a little, like hearing it out loud took some of the weight off. He leaned back, eyes fixed on the middle distance, and tapped his finger against the mug, steady, almost like the sound of a pencil on paper. I imagined that invisible ledger closing, the hard underline drawn, the page turned. But the numbers, they would always be there. Some debts don't erase. They only teach you to stop owing. I don't know what made me say it right then, but the words came out before I could think twice. I have this rule, I told him. I call it the warm hands rule. Mark raised an eyebrow, just enough to say he was curious. It's simple, I went on. When grief walks into the room, whether it's yours or someone else's, your hands should move. They move toward a glass of water, or a box of tissues, or someone's shoulder. You don't have to fix anything. You just have to make your hands warm, because grief makes everything else cold. He was very still, listening. I could hear the hiss of the espresso machine behind us, the clink of a spoon against porcelain at another table. And if your hands don't move, I said softly, if you freeze, it means something inside you is frozen too. Maybe fear, maybe selfishness, but something. And if you don't thaw it, you'll keep walking past people who need you. You won't even notice when you're doing it. Mark's eyes shifted down to his coffee, then back up to me. There was a sheen in them now, not quite tears, but close. That's exactly what it was, he murmured. Frozen. Like she didn't even feel the air change. I thought of all the times in my own life I'd moved without thinking, refilling a cup, smoothing a blanket, handing over a napkin before someone could ask. Not because I'm noble, but because it's instinct when you've trained yourself to see it. And then I thought of the times I hadn't moved, and how those moments still sat heavy in my chest years later. Mark leaned back, exhaling slowly. I didn't have a name for it until now, he said. The warm hands rule. Yeah, that's it. That's what was missing. I smiled, not because it was a happy moment, but because naming a thing can sometimes give it less power. It's not complicated, I said. But it is a choice. Every single time. We fell into a quiet that wasn't uncomfortable. Somewhere behind us, a faucet ran, water filling a glass. I imagined setting it down in front of someone, that small, simple act, and how it could mean the difference between feeling invisible and feeling seen. Mark's gaze was far away but softer now, as if, for the first time, someone had put the shape of his pain into words, and in doing so made it just a little easier to hold. It happened faster than I expected, though Mark told me later the decision had been building for months. One week we were talking about the warm hands rule over coffee. The next he was sitting across from me with a yellow legal pad, a black pen, and a look that was part exhaustion, part resolve. I called a lawyer, he said, just like that. No preamble, no apology. I told her I want to file for separation. Not next month. Now. There was no anger in his voice. Not the kind that burns hot and fades. This was quieter, steadier, the kind of anger that's cooled into something unshakable. He showed me the list he'd started. Utilities to transfer, items to pack, things Ben would need for school at the new place. There was nothing on it about revenge, nothing about proving a point. It was all about the boy. I'm not doing a midnight escape, he said. I want Ben to see me pack. I want him to know we're not running, we're moving forward. There's a difference. I helped him fold boxes in his garage one Saturday, the cardboard smell mixed with the faint scent of motor oil. We labelled each one in thick black marker. Kitchen, mugs, bathroom, towels, and the one that stopped us both for a second. Ben, books. That box was heavier than it looked, not just in weight, but in what it carried. Dog-eared paperbacks. A hardcover his grandmother had given him, her handwriting in the front. For my Ben. Love always, Grandma Eleanor. Mark ran his hand over the cover before setting it in the box. In Ben's room, he zipped up a duffel bag with practiced care, like he was tucking in a child for sleep. Shirts, jeans, the sweatshirt with the fading school logo. No frantic shoving, no mess. Just order. Intent. I noticed how Mark paused every so often, listening. Not for footsteps, Lara was gone for the day, but for the sound of Ben moving around the house. He wanted his son to feel the rhythm of it, to understand this wasn't a storm ripping through their lives, but a shift they could navigate together. By the time the boxes were stacked by the door, the legal pad lay on the kitchen counter with every item crossed off. Except one. At the bottom, in his careful handwriting, it said, "Make it feel like home." He underlined it once, hard. Then he capped the pen and closed the pad, as if sealing a promise. It was the first Saturday after the move when I met Ben. Mark had suggested the park, neutral ground, he called it, a place where the air wasn't thick with cardboard dust and half-empty shelves. The late morning sun was gentle, and the pond shimmered like a sheet of glass until the ducks broke it into ripples. Ben was sitting on the edge of the wooden dock when we walked up, hoodie hood up, hands in the front pocket, sneakers dangling just above the water. He didn't look at me right away, just nodded slightly when Mark said my name. I sat a few feet away, not too close, letting the sound of the ducks fill the space between us. "They're greedy," I said after a minute. "You toss one crumb and suddenly you've got 20 best friends." That earned me the faintest smile. "Dad says they'll follow you all the way to the parking lot if you let them," he said. His voice was quiet but steady. Mark disappeared for a few minutes to grab fries from the food stand. I stayed, watching the ducks paddle in tight little circles, their heads dipping under, tails straight up like exclamation points. Ben pointed at one. "That one's bossy," he said. "Keeps stealing from the others." "Every crowd's got one," I replied. And just like that, we were talking. Not about grief, not about the hallway or the move, but about ducks and the park's old carousel that hasn't worked in years and which pencils are best for sketching. When Mark came back, he handed Ben the fries and set a little paper cup of ketchup between us. Ben slid it closer to me without a word. An unspoken invitation. We ate like that, shoulders still apart but the space feeling less like a gap and more like a bridge under construction. We didn't say grandma. We didn't need to. There's a kind of understanding that doesn't require the hard words right away. Sometimes you start with ducks and fries and pencils, and you let the rest arrive when it's ready. Before we left, one of the ducks came close enough that Ben crouched down and held out the last fry. The duck snapped it up, water droplets catching the sunlight as it swam away. Ben glanced at me then, just a flicker of a look. And for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that wasn't guarded. It was small, but it was there. And it was enough for a first Saturday. By Sunday night, Mark kept glancing at his phone like it was a lifeline he didn't want to admit he was holding. We were in his new kitchen, the boxes mostly unpacked, the light over the table casting a warm circle on the wood. Ben was in his room, music faint behind a closed door. "She hasn't called," he said finally, not looking at me. He didn't have to say her name. Not once. Not to ask how he's settling in. Not to say goodnight. I didn't answer right away. Some truths don't need commentary. They need space to land. He set the phone down, then picked it back up, scrolling through nothing. "I keep thinking maybe she's giving him time," he went on. "Or maybe she doesn't know what to say." His voice wavered just enough to show the crack. "But then I think, if it were me, I wouldn't be able to stay away. I'd call. I'd show up." I could see the war in him. Guilt on one side, the need for self-protection on the other. That's when I told him about something I'd learned in hospice. "Grief minutes," I said. He looked at me like I'd offered him a puzzle piece. "You set a timer," I explained. 5 minutes, 10, whatever you can manage. For that time, you let yourself feel every bit of it. The sadness, the anger, the what-ifs. You don't push it away. You don't explain it. You just sit in it. And when the timer goes off, you take a breath and you get up. You don't have to be over it. You just have to keep living alongside it. Mark leaned back in his chair, considering. I reached over, picked up the small kitchen timer from the counter and set it between us. "Try it," I said. He pressed his thumb to the start button. The ticking filled the silence. For the first 2 minutes, he stared at the table. Then his hands came up, covering his face, his shoulders bowing under the weight. He stayed like that until the soft ding broke the air. He exhaled, a long, slow release. Then he set the timer aside. "I can't keep waiting for her to call," he said quietly. If she wanted to, she would have by now. There was no bitterness in it, just a finality, like closing a door you've been standing in too long. And in that moment, I knew he'd stopped looking at his phone for answers it would never give. I told Mark that in hospice, you see love in its smallest, barest form, stripped of all the performance, the grand gestures, the speeches, the perfect gifts. They fade. What stays are the moments so ordinary you'd miss them if you weren't looking. "There was a woman once," I began, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "Her name was Ada. She was 91, her lungs failing. We both knew she didn't have much time left. One afternoon, as I was helping her adjust her pillows, she whispered, 'I'm sorry.'" Mark frowned slightly like he couldn't see where the story was going. "I asked her what for," I said. And she smiled, barely, and told me she was apologizing to her breath, for leaving it. I let that sit for a moment, the quiet settling between us like dust in sunlight. She'd spent her whole life in service to others, kids, husband, neighbors. And in the end, she was saying goodbye to something we all take for granted until it's gone. Her own breath. That's how deeply she paid attention. Even at the very end, she noticed. I told him how Ada's husband used to fetch her sweater without her asking, how her daughter knew exactly how far to crack the window so the breeze would be cool but not cold. How a neighbour brought her a slice of lemon pie every Thursday because Thursday was the day she missed her mother most. That's love, I said. It's not complicated. It's the sweater, the window, the pie. It's paying enough attention to see the need before it's spoken. And when we stop doing that for each other, something essential breaks. Mark leaned forward, his forearms on the table, eyes fixed on the grain of the wood. Lara never noticed the little things, he said finally. Or maybe she did, but she didn't think they mattered. They matter, I said, my voice firmer than I intended. They matter more than the big declarations. Because when everything else falls away, that's what we remember. Who fetched the sweater? Who cracked the window? Who didn't walk past? He nodded slowly, like he was filing the thought away somewhere deep. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the bare branches. I stood, crossed to the window, and opened it just enough for a soft current to drift in. It carried the faint scent of rain, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Some truths are better held in silence, where they can settle into the heart without interference. The middle school gym smelled faintly of floor polish and popcorn from the concession stand. Rows of metal folding chairs lined the basketball court, already filling with parents adjusting their coats and flipping through programs. Mark and I found seats in the third row, close enough to see the nervous shifting of the kids on stage as they tuned their instruments. Ben was in the second clarinet section, his hair a little too long in the back, the cuffs of his shirt peeking from under his black sweater. He spotted us as he settled into his chair, and I gave him a small wave. He didn't wave back, too cool for that in front of classmates, but the corner of his mouth lifted. The lights dimmed slightly as the band director stepped to the microphone. Just as the first piece began, the gym doors squeaked open. Lara slipped in, her heels clicking against the polished floor in a way that turned heads. She didn't look for us. Instead, she took a seat near the back, scanning her phone before she'd even settled her bag on the floor. Mark didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on Ben, his hands folded tightly in his lap. I could feel the tension radiating from him, but he didn't say a word. The first two songs went by in a blur of squeaks and false starts, the kind of endearing chaos that only middle school musicians can produce. Then it was time for the solo. Ben's name was printed in the program, circled neatly in pencil, a little private celebration Mark had made before we left the house. Ben stood, clarinet in hand, and stepped to the microphone. I saw him glance toward the back, just once, and his shoulders tensed when he saw her, head bent over her phone. Without thinking, I leaned forward, elbows on my knees. Mark did the same. Our hands, both clasped, rested close enough that they almost touched. When Ben's eyes found us, I smiled. Mark gave a tiny nod, the kind that says, "You've got this." Something shifted then. Ben straightened his back, lifted his clarinet, and began to play. The first few notes wavered, but then the melody found its footing, warm and clear. By the time he finished, the applause was loud enough to fill every corner of that gym. Lara clapped politely, still seated far away. But Ben didn't look for her again. His eyes went to us, the ones leaning forward, both hands clasped, holding the space he needed to breathe. That night, after the concert, I couldn't sleep. The image of Ben's eyes finding us, and not her, replayed over and over. I sat at my kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper and a pen, the kind of pen that writes smoothly enough to keep up with whatever your heart spills out. I wasn't planning to mail anything. Some letters aren't meant for sending, they're meant for emptying what's been collecting inside you. I began in my head before the ink touched the page. Dear Lara. I thought about telling her what she'd missed, the way Ben's fingers shook at the start of his solo, how his shoulders dropped in relief when he saw someone leaning forward for him. The way Mark sat steady beside me, every muscle tight with hope. I wanted to write. You could have been part of that moment. You could have been the one he looked for. Instead, I wrote one line. The opposite of love is not hate. It's not noticing. Because that's what it was. Not noticing. Not seeing the glass of water someone needs, the hand that trembles, the courage it takes for a boy to stand in front of a gym full of people after the year he's had. It's walking past the crying in the hallway, scrolling through the solo, never asking how the first Saturday in a new place felt. I sat there, the pen hovering, wanting to list every small cruelty, every tally in the ledger Mark had described. But the truth was, that would make the letter about her, and she wasn't the point anymore. The point was this: the best revenge isn't ruin. It's a life so full of noticing that you make up for the times others didn't. It's seeing the ducks, and the way Ben draws with the same concentration his grandmother used to sew. It's knowing when Mark's silence means peace and when it means ache. I folded the paper once, then again, and slid it into an envelope without sealing it. It wasn't for her. It was for me. A way to take all that heaviness and put it somewhere safe, somewhere it couldn't poison the air around us. The envelope went into the back of my desk drawer, behind old birthday cards and grocery lists. Out of sight, but not forgotten. Sometimes revenge is just the decision to keep your eyes open even when it's easier to close them, especially then. The new place had a blue front door, the kind of blue that made you want to knock even if you had no reason to. It was a rental, nothing fancy, 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, and a living room just big enough for a couch, a coffee table, and the kind of lamp that makes evening light feel like honey. But it had good bones, as people like to say. More importantly, it had space for the 3 of us to breathe. The first Saturday morning there, I brought over my skillet and a bag of blueberries. If we're going to christen the kitchen, I told Mark and Ben, we're doing it with pancakes. Ben sat at the counter watching as I poured the batter, the spatula making that soft slap against the pan when I flipped them. By the time the second batch was ready, the kitchen smelled like warmth itself. Mark set the table while Ben lined up the syrup, forks and plates, like a small engineer making sure the angles were just right. We started building small traditions without really meaning to. Saturday pancakes, a chore chart on the fridge, not just the usual vacuuming and dishes, but things like choose music for dinner and pick a movie for Friday night. Ben took the music job seriously, curating playlists that swung from classic rock to movie soundtracks to songs I'd never heard but quickly learned to hum along with. One afternoon while we were clearing the table, Ben walked over to a box he hadn't unpacked yet. He dug around for a minute and came back holding a small black and white photo in a wooden frame. His grandmother Eleanor smiling in a way that seemed to light the whole picture. "Can I put this on the fridge?" he asked, his voice careful, almost testing the air. "Front and center," I said without hesitation. He smiled, a real one, not the polite version, and reached for a magnet. The soft click of it holding the frame in place felt like more than just an object sticking to metal. It was a piece of her finding a place in this new life. That evening, as we ate dinner with Ben's playlist playing softly in the background, I caught him glancing at the photo. Not with the ache of someone holding on to the past too tightly, but with the quiet comfort of someone who knows they're allowed to bring it into the present. The storm came in fast, sweeping across the neighborhood with a wall of wind and rain that rattled the blue door in its frame. By the time dinner was over, the lights flickered once, twice, then went out entirely. The house fell into that deep, velvety darkness you only get during a blackout, the kind where your own breathing sounds louder than usual. Mark found a flashlight in the kitchen drawer, the beam cutting a narrow path through the room. Ben sat cross-legged on the couch, the light catching the edges of his hair. Outside, the rain lashed against the windows in steady waves. We settled in together, the 3 of us, speaking in the low voices people use when the dark feels close. At first, we just listened to the storm, but then Ben's voice broke through so soft I almost missed it. "I remember the hallway," he said. Mark froze, the flashlight tilting slightly in his hand. I didn't say anything, just waited. She saw me, Ben went on, his words slow like he was pulling them out of a deep place. I looked right at her. I thought she'd come over. His breath hitched, and the sound of it was sharper than the rain. But she didn't. She just walked by. I kept thinking maybe I'd done something wrong. My chest ached. You didn't, I said, the words careful, steady. You didn't do anything wrong. Mark set the flashlight down so the beam spilled across the coffee table and onto the wall, illuminating the edge of a framed photo, the one of Eleanor that Ben had put on the fridge. No one moved for a while. Ben's shoulders shook the way they had that day in the hallway, but this time there was no one walking past. We stayed. That was the whole point. We stayed. Mark reached out first, his hand finding Ben's knee. I placed mine over both of theirs. We didn't tell him to stop crying, didn't try to fix it. We just sat in the dark, the storm outside like a second heartbeat, and let him know, without saying it outright, that we weren't going anywhere. When his breathing finally slowed, he wiped his eyes on his sleeve and leaned back against the couch. Thanks, he muttered, almost embarrassed. You don't have to thank us, Mark said quietly. We're right here. The flashlight beam caught the photo on the wall again, her smile faint but visible. And I thought, maybe this was the apology we'd all been waiting to give ourselves. It was a Thursday afternoon when the knock came. Sharp, deliberate, the kind of knock that expects to be answered right away. Mark glanced at me from the couch, then went to the blue door. When he opened it, Lara was standing there, her coat perfectly buttoned, her smile polite but thin, like it had been drawn on with a ruler. Can we talk? She said, her voice light in a way that felt practiced. Mark stepped aside, and she walked in without waiting. She glanced around the living room as if cataloguing the differences since she'd last been part of their daily lives. Her gaze landed on the photo of Eleanor on the fridge, but she didn't comment. I think, she began, setting her purse on the arm of the chair, that we need to figure out a way to do this. 50-50. Equal time. Equal feelings. I don't want anyone thinking I'm being shut out. Mark didn't sit. This isn't about percentages, he said evenly. It's about what Ben needs. Her smile tightened. Ben's fine. He's resilient. Grief isn't an emergency. People move on. That was when I spoke, surprising even myself. Grief isn't an emergency, I said, but it is a wound. I've sat at more bedsides than I can count, and I've seen what happens when people ignore it. It doesn't heal, it hardens. And the person learns that when they hurt, no one comes. Lara's eyes flicked to me, cool and assessing. I'm his mother, she said. Then be the one who shows up, I replied. Not just when it fits into your schedule. Not when it's easy, when it's inconvenient, when it's messy. That's when it counts. Mark's voice was calm, but there was no give in it. We're not splitting this like a calendar, he said. Ben's needs come first. If that means more time here right now, that's what it means. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then Lara picked up her purse, smoothed her coat, and gave a small nod. Not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement. Well, she said, I guess you've made your choice. Mark didn't answer. He opened the door. She stepped through, the heels of her boots clicking once on the porch before the door closed with a quiet, final thud. The blue door stayed shut, the room still holding the echo of her visit. And in that silence, I knew the line had been drawn. Not in anger, but in protection. It was Ben's idea, though he didn't frame it like that. One Saturday morning, he wandered into the kitchen while Mark and I were making tea and said, almost casually, Grandma used to grow rosemary, right? Mark looked up from the kettle. She did. Big bush right by the back steps. Ben shrugged, but there was something deliberate in the way he said, we could plant one here. So that afternoon we drove to the little nursery on the edge of town. Ben picked the plant himself, A sturdy rosemary with a scent so strong you could smell it before you even touched the leaves. Back at the house, we found a spot near the kitchen window where the sunlight pooled in the afternoons. The three of us knelt in the dirt, the air cool but gentle. I showed Ben how to loosen the roots without tearing them, how to make space in the soil that was just big enough but not too big. The trowel made a satisfying scrape as it cut through the earth. When we settled the rosemary into place, the smell rose up, like something familiar finally coming home. Mark brushed the dirt from his hands. How about we make this a thing? Every time we're here, we share one brave memory and one silly memory about your grandma. Ben hesitated, then grinned. Okay, brave memory, when she stood up to the neighbor who kept stealing our trash cans. Mark laughed. She was 5 feet tall and fearless. I went next. Silly memory. The time she accidentally wore 2 different shoes to the grocery store and didn't notice until someone pointed it out in the checkout line. Ben's laugh burst out then, quick, unguarded, the kind that makes you want to hear it again. He looked down at the rosemary, still smiling. She'd like this, he said. We went inside afterward and made her favourite tea, chamomile with a twist of lemon. The kettle whistled, and soon the 3 of us were at the table, our hands wrapped around warm mugs, steam curling in the space between us. The rosemary outside caught the afternoon light, its green sprigs glowing against the dark soil. It felt like more than a plant. It felt like a promise, that we would keep noticing, keep remembering, and keep making space for the people who weren't here to claim it themselves. And when Ben laughed again, I realized it wasn't just a ceremony for her. It was for him, too. Maybe even for all of us. Watching Ben find his laughter again made me think about the silences I've carried in my own life, the ones I'm not proud of. It's easy to talk about the times you showed up, the moments you got it right. But the truth is, there were corners I didn't step into when I should have. I remembered one night when my daughter was 12. She was sitting on her bed, her face blotchy from crying about a fight with her best friend. I stood in the doorway, unsure of what to say, telling myself she needed space. The truth? I was afraid I'd say the wrong thing, so I said nothing at all. I left her there, curled up alone, thinking I was doing the right thing. Years later, I still see her in that doorway-shaped frame, and I still wish I'd crossed the room. There was another time, after Michael died, when a neighbour stopped by to offer condolences. She started crying and I froze. Grief was too close, too raw. I mumbled something about needing to check the kettle and walked away. That moment still stings, because I know what it's like to be left standing with your sorrow. So when people talk about Lara and the hallway, I don't let myself fall into the easy trap of thinking I'm somehow better. I've been her, in smaller ways. I've walked past. I've chosen the safety of silence over the risk of being awkward or wrong. But I've learned, late, but I've learned, that silence in those moments costs more than a clumsy word ever could. The lesson wasn't a flash of wisdom. It was slow, like water wearing down stone, shaped by years of watching people die and watching the living regret what they didn't say, didn't do. Sitting at my kitchen table now, I took a deep breath and whispered it out loud, though no one else was in the room. I forgive you, I said to that younger version of myself, the one in the doorway, the one holding the kettle. You didn't know yet, but you do now. The words didn't erase the memories, but they loosened something. My chest felt lighter. On the counter sat an old photo of my daughter, gap-toothed and grinning. I picked it up, holding it like you might hold a bird, careful not to grip too tightly. And for the first time in years, I could look at it without the shadow of that closed door. A year can change the shape of a life so completely that you almost forget what it used to look like. Almost. The seasons had turned once more, the rosemary by the kitchen window now taller, its scent brushing the air whenever we opened the door. Ben had grown too, a little taller, a little surer, the guardedness in his eyes replaced with something steadier. It was a grey Saturday morning when we found ourselves back at the same church where I had first seen him in that hallway. Different service, different family, but the same quiet air of farewell. Mark was beside me, Ben just ahead, taller now but still with that same slope to his shoulders when the day felt heavy. The service was almost over when I heard it. A muffled sob, sharp enough to cut through the rustle of coats and the creak of pews. I turned my head and saw a little girl, maybe 8, standing just inside the side hallway. Her hands were balled into fists, her cheeks wet. She was alone. I didn't think. My body just moved. I stood up, the wooden pew groaning softly under the shift. I heard another movement, Mark, rising beside me, and then a third, Ben. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The three of us stepped out from the row and into the aisle, our footsteps firm but unhurried, soft enough to keep the moment gentle, certain enough to leave no doubt about where we were going. The girl looked up as we approached, her eyes wide, as if unsure whether we were real or just something she'd hoped for. I crouched down to her level, Mark just behind me, Ben to my side. "Hey," I said softly, "you're not alone." Her breathing steadied, just a little. Mark offered her a tissue. Ben, without hesitation, held out his hand. She took it. Somewhere behind us the service continued. The organ, the voices, the measured rhythm of a farewell. But in that hallway, there was only the sound of our footsteps arriving and the quiet that follows when someone finally feels seen. Later, as we walked back to our seats, I realized I hadn't looked for permission, hadn't wondered if it was my place. Love doesn't wait for the perfect moment. It just goes where it's needed. And as I sat down again between Mark and Ben, I thought, this is what it sounds like when love arrives. Footsteps. Nothing more. Nothing less. What part of this story touched you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to read them. If this story felt close to your heart, give it a like, subscribe if you want to be part of a space where real stories matter. Got a couple more minutes? Check out the next story. It's also about the things we rarely say out loud.